Delta, where we did optical gas imaging, demonstration of the optical gas imaging technology using an OGI camera to help operators within the Niger Delta. Like we went to 5 different facilities just so that they see that there are technologies that they can use for their day-to-day activities, for leak detection and repair. And this sits very well within Nigeria's methane guidelines and the requirements that are imposed on operators by the guidelines in terms of emissions reduction. So what we saw in Nigeria was that, first of all, we carried out a field campaign, like I noted, using an OGI camera, optical gas imaging camera. And this allowed us to detect methane emissions that are not visible to the naked eye. And we identified emissions from several parts of the facilities that we visited around Kwale area in Delta State. And those emissions were coming largely from storage tanks and from processing equipment. And interestingly, even the facilities that were not fully operational still had emissions. So there were like 2 facilities that we visited, and we realized that they were down, and then there were emissions because I think there were some residual oil that were emitting within the process facilities. So beyond the technical findings, the campaign also helped to build understanding and trust among regulators and operators, because we couldn't have gone there without the support of the regulator, which is the NUPRC, the Nigerian Upstream Petroleum Regulatory Commission. And they had to get the operators to cooperate with us. So that was, I think, one of the advantages of us, not just demonstrating that the technology exists and that leak detection and repair is feasible, but then, we're able to build this trust and understanding between regulators and operators. Now, in terms of understanding detection technologies, methane detection technologies operate at different scales. And at the facility level, you can usually use optical gas imaging cameras that allows the operator to identify specific sources of emissions. And these OGI cameras can sometimes even do not just detection, but then they can do quantification. So they can quantify and tell you that based on these emissions, this is the quantity of methane that you are losing to the atmosphere. And at a larger scale, you can use satellites, that are in space. So there are different organizations with satellites having different tools on those satellites that can help detect emissions across regions by helping to identify hotspots. Sometimes this can be a daunting task because the weather condition can affect how much emissions you can see. And sometimes you might need these companies to deploy their satellites. You give them coordinates and they may deploy these satellites like 20 times or 25 times, before they are able to detect emissions due to weather conditions. But then in between, at the intermediate level, you have drones and aircrafts that can help to provide that intermediate detail. Because, drones and aircrafts can fly over facilities or landfills without necessarily being at an altitude that can be affected by weather, the way satellites are affected by the weather. So it is important to understand that detecting emissions is different from quantifying them. It's one thing to detect, it's another to quantify. But like I said, some of these technologies, like the newer versions of the optical gas imaging cameras, can help to even quantify. And measurement, therefore, requires additional analysis and validation. I think researchers have different ways in which they can analyze and quantify emissions. So let's say emissions are coming from a particular landfill, and they can use the size of the landfill and the volume of emissions per unit time to do some rough calculations and tell you how much this landfill is emitting, based on the size of the landfill and what is the quantity of these emissions over time. Now, in terms of turning detection into real reduction, so you detect, what do you do? I think the ultimate aim of detecting emissions is to discuss, is to see. So somebody can please mute Ishaq Habib, please, the moderator, if you can mute.
Please mute your mic. Please mute your mic.
Thank you. So in terms of turning detection into real reductions, if you are detecting, I think the ultimate aim of detection is to find viable ways of reducing emissions. So first of all, detection is the first step. We all agree, I think. And the real value comes from the action. So if you detect and you have no additional actions in terms of how to reduce the emissions, then it might look like it's an exercise in futility. So leak detection and repair programs, this is a familiar term, I think, within methane policy discussions, ELDA. So usually you hear this abbreviation of ELDA, leak detection and repair. It involves regular inspections and timely repairs of identified leaks. So you detect leak and you repair these leaks immediately. Now, I think the global best practice is that requires that we should do leak detection and repair at least 4 times a year. So it means it's a quarterly activity. Now, some operators might push back. So if you take, let's say, operators who are producing in offshore environments, I think they will tell you that it's a bit difficult to do leak detection and repair in those environments. Maybe it's easier to do ELDA in onshore environments. But again, the best of regulations and guidelines will prefer that leak detection and repair be conducted at least 4 times a year. And once you detect, it is important that you have a plan for repairing that point that is emitting methane. So another important aspect is responding quickly to large emission events. So sometimes when you do leak detection and repair, they are basically, you basically discover emissions from smaller point sources, maybe from valves and so on, or from some kind of, storage tanks and so on, depending on the size of those tanks. But there are sometimes some very large emission sources. So you could have some pipelines, that are found in very remote environments that are detected by certain satellites that show that, there are a lot of emissions. And so there is the need to respond very quickly to those large emission events. And a small number of these events can also account for a large share of emissions. So imagine you have little of these events all combining, in a cumulative way to end up as large emissions. And I think we will probably say a thing or two in subsequent slides about what is emissions from an economic perspective. You are basically losing natural gas when you are emitting methane. So as much as possible, if you stop emissions, it means you are saving a resource that has economic value. So without any follow-ups, after detections, I think detection efforts do not lead to any meaningful reduction. So first of all, do detections, but then what are the follow-up plans? Now, for the waste sector, which we believe is often overlooked, and waste here means organic waste because it's only from organic waste that you get methane emissions. So the waste sector is a significant source of methane emissions, especially in rapidly growing cities. I was in Kumasi, I was in a place called Pon, in both of them in Ghana, with a device that was able to detect methane emissions from landfills that are there or dump sites that are there. I was also in Nairobi at the Dandora dump site to detect a lot of emissions. My colleague was at some point in Morocco to detect emissions, and I think I was also at a landfill called Kosihiwen landfill in Abidjan area to also detect a lot of emissions. So whenever you go through any of these waste facilities, there are always emissions. But then somehow the waste sector is often overlooked. So organic waste that emits are things like food and green waste, food and vegetables, which decomposes and produces methane when it is not properly managed. And in many cases, waste is collected and disposed of without separation. So you realize that everything is not well separated, especially in Africa. We don't separate our waste from, let's say, our homes, which in a way helps to increase emissions. And at the same time, there is limited infrastructure for capturing methane from landfills. So you have dump sites. Most of the time, I think it's dump sites that we have. A country like Nigeria of more than 200 million people, sees struggles with waste because we don't even have a landfill. And if you don't have landfills, it means you can't capture your methane, which you can convert, or rather, it becomes a resource once it is captured. So this creates both a challenge as well as an opportunity for improvement. Now, I mentioned Cote d'Ivoire as an example, and in Cote d'Ivoire, we have used satellites to observe emissions. So those satellites revealed continuous methane emissions from a landfill called Kosihiwen landfill. And this was notable because the landfill was designed to capture gas. Imagine a landfill that is supposed to capture gas, but then we realized that the landfill was emitting significantly. It means probably the gas capture facility is broken. And the issue was related to operational practices. And I think those practices led to the gas capture facility to be in the state where it is now. And I think it also involved things around sealing the facility, effectively, and some delayed covering of waste and so on, because a landfill is a very fascinating facility when you visit. It's very well engineered. There are different processes and so on. So if operational practices go wrong, you realize that at the end, the landfill is not well utilized optimally. And I think this is an example that highlights the importance of not only designing systems, so because you have a system that is already in place, but also the need, it is like an example on the importance of ensuring that these systems are properly managed. You know, it is one thing to have something very well designed, you know, very fascinating to see. But then if they are not properly managed, you know, you go back to emitting volumes of methane as if there was no landfill in place. So methane as a missed economic opportunity. First of all, let's remember that methane emissions represent a lost opportunity because a large portion of emissions can be reduced using existing technology. So if you are not capturing emissions, it means you are not using technologies that are already in place to help capture those emissions. And the captured gas can be used for electricity generation and other productive uses because it's basically natural gas. And this creates economic value while also reducing emissions. And in countries that are facing energy shortages, such as a lot of African countries, this becomes particularly important. Now, if you go to advanced societies, and I was privileged to visit a landfill in Texas, I think that was early last year. You know, it's interesting that you realize that oil companies now go to landfills to capture methane. So there is this oil company called Kinder Morgan, and I think they are very well known within the US, and you see them in landfills in the US where they are capturing methane and putting them in pipelines. So you realize on a landfill that has been decommissioned, because that decommissioned landfill, which is a mound, you know, a huge mound, is actually like a mound of methane. And all they do is to come and drill some wells. So they drill wells, they put some wells on these landfill, and they are capturing methane continuously for probably 10 years or more. By the time they feel that they have captured a lot of this methane and they are losing the production, they can easily move to another decommissioned landfill. By then, another landfill is ready, or it has already been decommissioned, and they move there. So it's basically a win-win because, you know, you are dumping your waste properly, and later on you are using it for electricity generation. So maybe we can go to the next slide on the role of policy. So basically what I do now, and I've been here for 4 years working at Clean Air Task Force, and basically what I do is to work on policy. So I started as a scientist, and now I do a lot of policy work by trying to convince governments across Africa, regulators, you know, in the oil and gas and waste sectors, that there is need to reduce emissions. And so policy plays a critical role in methane mitigation, and regulations help to define what operators are required to do. So governments will come up with regulations, and here I work with governments to help them to design regulations, including emissions control and reporting. But then there is a difference between regulations and guidelines. So once you have regulations, you also need to come up with guidelines that helps to ensure that the regulations are very well understood. So another thing that I do with operators is to work with them to not only have regulations in place, but to also design guidelines that have all the attributes of best practices, and and then help them to see how these guidelines can be operationalized, to get like a roadmap that helps to operationalize these guidelines. So regulations and guidelines, I think, have to go hand in hand. However, policies must be practicable or practical and implementable. I think it is not true that you can just bring policies or guidelines from a country in Latin America and come and impose it in Africa. So every country is kind of different, and you need to study their own realities and also advise them on what will work and what will probably not work, sorry, effectively. And you kind of see what are the global best practices that can still apply in those countries, despite differences in geography, in the regulatory framework, and so on. So enforcement is also essential. If you have policies and you can't enforce, that's another big problem. So without enforcement, regulations have very limited impact. And so the ultimate aim of policies is to help align policies with broader climate goals, with broader energy goals, because, as countries, you still have to go out there and meet other countries and speak about each of these countries' efforts toward meeting like the global targets. So whether it's Paris agreements, whether it's the global methane pledge, etc. So everybody is working at different levels, but then at the end, it's important that all the things that we are working on should be tailored toward meeting the broader climate and energy goals. I think that's the ultimate aim of policy. Now, why do MRV systems matter? So MRV here stands for monitoring, reporting, and verification. And so once you have policies, then it means you have to start collecting data. So imagine if the Nigerian government has a methane guideline for the oil and gas industry, and it means those guidelines require that the operators in that industry should begin to submit some data to the regulator, and that's where monitoring comes in. And then they need to report what they are doing based on certain standard formats and timelines that will be shared by government. And then there is need to have like a way in which you can verify the data so that we know that what is being reported is credible and where are we. Verification helps to tell us where we are with regards to emissions reduction. So you might have some baseline data and then you realize, okay, you need you need to use this data to ensure that you are making progress. So monitoring, reporting, and verification systems are essential for methane mitigation. And monitoring involves collecting data on emissions as well as on operations. And reporting ensures that this data is shared in a consistent and transparent way. So a lot of countries may not even have that consistent way of reporting. And that's what I also am involved in with some countries to ensure that we have standardized templates. Because if you are getting data from the oil industry, you realize that different operators or different companies have different facilities with regards to, and here I mean the age of the facilities differ. So with different ages of those facilities, you realize they don't give you the same kind of data that you need. So regulators are sometimes finding themselves in a position where they are a bit not confused, I would say, but a bit maybe frustrated because they don't have unified data. I mean, unified templates that allow them to easily compare data from different facilities. So verification also helps to ensure that the data is accurate and credible, like we've already said before. And I think the key takeaway here, the key takeaway here is that without strong MRV systems, it is really difficult to track progress or enforce regulations. So in Nigeria, what we are doing now is that we are working to strengthen the regulations and the guidelines by having monitoring, reporting, and verification in place. So we started from, helping to develop regulations, helping to develop guidelines, getting the guidelines approved, ensuring that both regulators and operators understand their role within those guidelines, and then doing some technology demonstration like leak detection and repair. And then now we are looking at how we can help the government to ensure that those regulations are better strengthened by having a robust monitoring, reporting, and verification in place. And so that's why I think that the key takeaway here is that if you don't have strong MRV systems in place, then we can say that it is really difficult to track progress or enforce regulations. So what is slowing progress? So despite progress, and I think we've achieved progress in Africa, at least in certain African countries, Nigeria is one country that is ahead of all of the other countries that are producing oil. And despite all of this progress, some challenges remain, and one of them is data systems, challenges around data systems, and data systems are often incomplete or fragmented. And then there are also gaps in technical capacity among regulators and operators. So the regulators themselves, they need some training and capacity building for them to be able to hold the operators to account. And the operators also need training because there are certain technologies that they are not aware of. And we also help them to achieve this. That's why after we got the methane guidelines in Nigeria approved, the first thing we did was to start working on capacity building for both regulators and operators. And financing is another challenge, particularly for smaller operators. I think generally we all can agree that the oil industry has a lot of money, but then sometimes when you work in a country that is only starting, or you work with operators that are relatively small in terms of their operations, you now realize that there are some issues around implementing emissions mitigation strategies because they complain of costs associated with that. So finally, methane is still often viewed as a compliance issue rather than an opportunity. And I think that's also a mindset that we need to change. We think that, or rather, the operators might think that methane is just a compliance issue. So somebody is forcing you to comply. But we need to change that thinking to see it as an opportunity. And that opportunity is that it gives us an avenue on how we can save a resource that is useful. And so this means that there is an economic opportunity there. So what needs to happen next? I think moving forward, based on all of these things that we have said, the focus should be on implementation. We have guidelines, or probably coming up with guidelines. It's not really the issue, but it's about implementation. And to implement, it means we need to start building systems that will help to support the actions that are needed in implementation. Not just the policy alone, but you need systems that help to support action. And also, we need to scale approaches that are already proven. So we scale up approaches that are proven. So if there is anything like a pilot project that has already been proven, then why not scale it up? If leak detection and repair is working with certain cameras, why not scale it up? Why not invest in all the technologies you can invest in to do leak detection and repair? And then it's important to think of collaboration across countries that can help to accelerate progress by sharing knowledge and experience. And this is something that we have been able to do in Nigeria by bringing Ghana. So we funded regulators in Ghana to come to Nigeria to speak with the Nigerian Upstream Petroleum Regulatory Commission so that they learn, and this is what we call peer-to-peer learning. And then even the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, which is an initiative of the United Nations Environment Program, and we do get a lot of support from them. Even they have an initiative that they call Methane Regulator to Regulator meeting or something like that. And it is under that program that they are hoping to help scale up or accelerate collaboration between countries. So if a particular country is well advanced, why not bring all of that knowledge together by sharing your experience with countries that are just starting. So this is my final slide as a conclusion slide. So in closing, I will say methane reduction offers one of the most immediate ways to slow climate change, because nearly half of the problem of climate change is attributable to short-lived climate pollutants. And when you talk about short-lived climate pollutants, methane is at the top of SLCPs, or short-lived climate pollutants. So the solutions are also already available. The challenge is to implement them effectively and at scale. It's important to add at scale, which is that, I understand that there is a challenge, of implementing something, let's say, at pilot levels and then trying to move it up, to a scale where the impact is felt, let's say, across the entire industry. And so if we take a practical approach, we can achieve meaningful reductions, and we can do this in a relatively short time because we don't have time. And so with this, I will say thank you very much. And I think I will have to run. I would have loved to hear from you and probably get a few questions, but I have just 5 minutes to join another meeting. So I may have to run in the next 2-3 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the insightful section. We appreciate all the knowledge you have shared on this section. So far, like our guest speaker said, he won't have lots of time to answer your questions. So we'll just make it brief. If you have your question, you can just drop it briefly so our guest speaker can respond before he leaves. Okay, Tahir Bashir, you can unmute and ask your question.
Sorry for intervention. This is Usman speaking. I would like to thank Prof for this wonderful presentation and for taking time to come in and share his expertise and knowledge on methane reduction, especially in the country. I was on a journey, but I just arrived. So I would like to personally thank you for honoring our invitation, sir. And we look forward to future collaborations and also future projects and programs. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Madasman.
I don't know if Tahir Bashir Ali can ask his question. Okay.
No questions. It was an applause. Thank you again, Doctor.
Okay.
So any question, comments?
Maybe they can share by email. I have to run.
Okay. Thank you,
Perfect,
sir.
sir. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thank you all for participating in this section. This is the end of the section. Thank you all for participating. See you next month for our next month's webinar. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you all. This is the size of the package. Bye.